Don doesn't forget his friends.
The early 2000s saw something of a renaissance for video games, with the open-world sandbox formula that would come to dominate the land for the next 2 decades really starting to properly establish itself. The original Mafia was one such of these games, and offered a stark contrast in tone to the other notable sandbox of the time. It was a more grounded approach, with speed limits to stick to when driving around, and a lot less tongue-in-cheek humour throughout. In what is now something of an age of remakes, Mafia Definitive Edition stands out from the crowd as one of the strongest in terms of effort. This is not just an HD reskin of the original, the entire game has been redesigned from the ground up, with gorgeous visuals, updated game mechanics, and vastly improved vehicle handling. On top of that, the team at Hangar 13 have completely rewritten the dialogue, bringing in new voice actors and full motion capture. So with all these bells and whistles in place, is Mafia Definitive Edition an offer you can't refuse? Or should it be sleeping with the fishes? Let's start with the good. The city of Lost Heaven has been almost completely redesigned and it looks incredible. Skyscrapers are taller, streets are more lively, and the lighting is up there with what you'd expect of a AAA game at this stage of a console generation. There are definitely a few irritating graphical bugs and glitches to be ironed out, but honestly that seems to be the norm for almost every game in this day and age. Driving has been completely reworked, with the stiff handling of the original left behind where it belongs, and vehicles now feeling much more weighty and responsive. This is an especially well-received change not only for anyone who remembers that mission, not that it still isn't a challenge of course, but also just because driving through the vintage streets with a great collection of 30s jazz blaring through the radio is now an absolute joy, rather than just an A to B. There's an option to switch between standard and simulation mode as well. It's cool, but expect a lot of spinning out in the latter mode. Alongside the refreshed handling, period-accurate motorbikes have been added to the game, and they're great fun to zip around the city on. A new addition that I thought was really cool is the way that GPS is handled when driving, with little road signs that fade in and out when needed. The story has also been given more attention to detail than the original allowed for. Character relationships feel more fleshed out and three-dimensional, and the voice acting is mostly strong throughout. If you're a returning player from the original game, it can seem a little jarring hearing the new actors at first, but they should grow on you fairly quickly. Speaking of which, something that can seem more jarring for new players is that in spite of the beautifully crafted open world, Mafia is not in fact an open world game. The story itself is very linear, in part thanks to its framing device, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing. It keeps things focused, and while this isn't a long game by any means, it controls the pace really nicely. Free roam fans need not panic though, as just like the original, there is a free ride mode that allows players to explore and take in the city at their own pace. There are still plenty of collectibles and secret vehicles to find throughout too, so there's something to keep you occupied post-game, if only for a while. Now this of course brings me back to the gameplay, which sees a mixed bag of updates. Missions are primarily driving, shooting and punching, with small elements of stealth and tailing sprinkled in appropriately. Where the driving has been a clear focus for improvement, the shooting and punching feels much more dated and less dynamic. The addition of a cover system has helped a little, but the aiming is sluggish and gunfights can quickly boil down to essentially staying planted while enemies take turns popping up to get shot. One thing you will need to watch out for though is the Molotovs. These are the game's way of forcing you to move around the space and vary your cover spots. It's a nice way of adding spice, but sometimes it does feel overdone. However, I do like that your health is still non-regenerating, it only takes a few shots to take you down, and the amount of ammo you get does force you to think carefully about your shots. Fistfights are pretty much just timing button presses until you eventually get a nice little finisher, but that gets old fast. A lot of the enjoyment of this is going to come primarily out of the difficulty settings, with Classic mode offering some of the most challenging gameplay and demanding the use of more varied mechanics. For example, in situations where you could quickly find yourself outnumbered and outgunned, stealth is likely the best approach to thin out the crowd first, and it doesn't feel too slow either. On the other hand, if you're on an easier difficulty, then you might find this fairly unnecessary. The difficulty also has an impact on how the police treat your misdemeanors when driving around the city. On Classic, they'll be hot on your tail for any speeding or small traffic violations, whereas playing on easier settings will lead them to mostly leave you alone for all but the worst offences. Personally, as a returning player, my favourite way to play this, and the way I'd recommend, is Classic, but I appreciate the ability for players to tailor the experience in a more accessible way. Overall, in spite of the fairly vanilla combat and a few features lacking when compared to other modern titles, this is a great game to play. For new players, there's never been a better time to see what the series has to offer, especially with the Mafia collection available, released earlier in the year. As for returning players, This truly is the definitive way to experience the classic.